Welcome. My name is David Lyon. I'm the director of the Surveillance Studies Centre, and I've been chairing the little team that put together this series during the year. This is the final event in what has been a year-long series, part of the celebration of the 175th birthday of Queen's University. And it's involved people from several faculties and departments. And I should thank that group, first of all, and several of the group members are here this evening, and it's been really fascinating and fun to get together with people from quite different faculties, departments, schools, and whatnot than those from which I come, which is sociology and the Faculty of Law. The idea of the series was to try to, in the first place, define big data. I wouldn't say we've succeeded, but we've talked about how to define it. We've tried to describe the different ways that big data is used nationally, internationally, and on Queen's campus itself. We've had some really interesting presentations about how people are using big data on this campus. And we said that our third D was going to be to debate, to try to get to grips with the pros and cons of shifts to big data practices in many different areas. And tonight then, for our last event, we're thinking about big data futures. Where is this thing going? Where should it go? And that's what we're here to discuss and debate this evening. I'm going to start by just asking my friend and colleague Linda Jessup if she would just come and say a couple of words on behalf of the university. Linda is an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science with special interest in research. That's her responsibility, and also she's most interested in multidisciplinary activities. So, Linda.
Good evening. I've been asked to come and thank you for coming and to welcome you to Queen's University. We're delighted to have you here. You can relax. David told me I have 120 seconds to sing the praises of the Surveillance Center. I can't do that in 120 seconds, but I can tell you that it occupies a pride of place at Queen's University. And he did say this gives me an opportunity to speak to something close to my heart, and it does. Multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity at Queen's. The center stands for this, encourages this, and your presence here tonight speaks strongly to it. To the coming together of people from various backgrounds, various intellectual formations and disciplines, to define issues of mutual interest and to discuss them in venues such as this. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion tonight. And again, thank you for coming, and thank you all.
Thanks, Linda. I'll echo the thanks. I'm also noticing that there are people here from the professorial ranks. There are people here from staff. There are undergraduate students. There are graduate students. There are people from the city of Kingston. It's really good to see you all. So I may have missed your particular designation, but it's really lovely to see such a variety of folks here this evening. It would be remiss of me not to mention the kind of support that we've had in trying to put this series together during the year. And it's been financial support partly, but just support, practical support as well. So the following groups and these parties have been very supportive. The Smith School of Business, the School of Computing, the Matariki Network of Universities, the Faculty of Law, School of Graduate Studies, the Office of the Vice Principal Research, and the Surveillance Studies Centre. So thank you to all our helpers, supporters, sponsors. The evening's going to start with two talks from our panelists, whom I'll introduce in a second. And that will be followed by some questions that were recorded from previous speakers in the series. And we're dumping these questions on tonight's panelists to see whether the questions that our previous speakers couldn't think of an answer to, they can. So that's the challenge. And then, oh, you didn't realize that, Frank? Yeah, it's part of the deal. And then following that, there'll be a moment for open Q&A. So the whole program will last from 6:30 to 8:30. And that's when we'll bring it to a close. And there's an incentive for us to finish at 8:30 because the food from the reception will still be out there until then, but not for long afterwards. One thing about the questions, which can, if you're on live stream, be answered any time. The hashtag is Big Data 175. So all one word, hashtag BD175. Joan's written it on the board for you. So if you're either in the room or if you are with the live stream, you can use that to ask questions at any time. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. You've already seen the description of our speakers as it's appeared on the screen, and we want to get on with the business of the evening, so I won't spend a lot of time introducing them. Our first speaker is Dr. Evelyn Ruppert, and she is a Canadian data sociologist. That is not a sociologist who depends upon data, but rather who is analyzing data sociologically. Of course, she depends on data as well, but and she is currently at Goldsmiths, University of London in England. And she's the editor of a fine journal called Big Data and Society. So Evelyn is our first speaker, and I'm going to introduce both speakers right now, and then Frank will continue directly on from Evelyn. Frank Pasquale, also delighted to have you with us. And he is with the Faculty of Law at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And in the context of tonight's event, he's best known for his book, The Black Box Society, which is an analysis of ways in which algorithms are made and used and their meaning for us in this context. So I'm going to ask Evelyn if she would come and speak first, and they're relatively short speeches, and then immediately afterwards, Frank will join. Thanks, Evelyn.
Thanks very much. Well, it's really my pleasure to be here, and I thank you very much, David, especially for the invitation, and especially on the event of this 175th anniversary of Queen's University, but also on this series that you've called Big Data Futures, because it's about the future that I really want to talk about. I think it's also important to follow from what was said earlier about the Surveillance Studies Center, which I think has been really formative and important in the debates and discussions academically, internationally, on questions of surveillance, on big data, and the implications they have for societies. And there's been a lot of leadership coming out of that center for lots of us around the world. When I proposed the title for my talk, it was about a year ago. I checked my email, David, and I thought, wow, and I called it Data Politics then, but little did I know how much data politics would be such a central question of our times and the kinds of issues that we are troubling a lot of us these days. But I first also want to note that the title of the talk comes from an edited collection that I'm working on with two other scholars at the moment. One is Enga Nyssen, who is in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary, University of London, and the second is DJ Bigot, who is in sociology at Sciences Po in Paris. That collection will come out in 2018. I mention it also not only because it's the title, but as we've been working through it and as the pieces have been coming together, we've been increasingly confronted with the necessity of us to talk about and think about data politics in our times. And I think, of course, the topic that I'm most thinking about at the moment is the recent debates on how big data was used in the US elections. And the UK referendum as well, to create personalized political advertising to influence how people voted. This is just one example, I think, of how big data, especially that of social media, can be and is being used to manipulate, as they say in a lot of the media press on this, people and their voting behavior. George Monbiot, writing in The Guardian recently, noted that we must act now to own what he calls political technologies, otherwise they're going to start owning us and our electoral processes. He was also referring to a company that has become quite notorious in terms of its analytics, that is Cambridge Analytica, which is partly also owned by U.S. billionaire Robert Mercer, who also happens to be a friend of Nigel Farage, the former UKIP leader. And it's been widely reported that that company helped to swing both the U.S. election and the UK referendum by mining Facebook data and using it to create profiles, predicting people's personalities, and then tailoring advertising to their psychological profiles. Now, there's a lot of dispute about whether these claims are legitimate and whether this really happened, and a lot of questions have been raised on it. However, the UK's privacy watchdog, the Information Commissioner's Office, sees that there is enough evidence to launch an inquiry, and it has done so. So it's interesting, in the wake of what already are quite uneven power and influence over elections, whether it's financing or if it's media alliances, we now have the circulation of misinformation or disinformation and techniques such as bot swarming, whereby fake online identities are created to give the impression that a lot more people are following a political cause than actually are. Now, there are some of the kinds of threats, as we can call them, that have been raised as being instrumental here. And it's interesting that recently Tim Berners-Lee, who is credited with the founding of the World Wide Web, recently pronounced on its 28th anniversary that these threats are the sharing of our personal data, about the circulation of misinformation, and also political advertising. And one of his solutions is a call for new ways for people, he says, to own their own data. And he argues that the web was built for us and by all of us, and so we all can and should play a role in trying to reclaim it and define its future. So what I think these examples foreground is that data and politics are increasingly inseparable. Data is not only shaping our social relations, our preferences, and in many cases our life chances, but our very democracies, we could say. And that is why I think it's important to talk about data politics. But I'm going to do so by turning attention from these questions of manipulation that I started with and focus on who is the addressee of data politics. Who is the we? Who is the us that is being appealed to? I think especially in relation to the implications for our political systems, we need to think about who that we is, and I will suggest that that we is the rights-claiming citizen. So Monbiot says, we must act now. Berners-Lee says we should play a role in defining the future of the internet, and I say, well, where are the digital citizens of the internet? So that's basically the setup for my talk tonight. But before I elaborate, I wanted to give a final word of introduction to specify about these images that I have put before you, which are going to accompany what I have to say. And they're from various designers that I've collected these from as a way of giving what I hope are provocative and imaginative images for you to think through my text and perhaps imaginatively through the images open up some thoughts and understandings of what I'm saying. It may not always be successful, but we'll give it a try. So I think the question of data politics, of course, extends beyond that of electoral analytics, and also those issues of manipulation. It includes what we can call intense struggles over the internet as a space of control, of profit, of cybercrime or exploitation. Those are all the kinds of keywords we see a lot in the media today. But also, we still see and think about it as a space of sharing, of connectivity, of new associations, of politics, and of openness. And I think it's instructive to think about those struggles or tensions, to recall how in the early 1990s, which for some of you may not have been an era you remember, but one that I was certainly part of, there was an advent of what was referred to then as cyberspace. The internet then was sort of celebrated as an independent and a kind of almost libertarian space where digital citizens, as John Katz put it, were inventing new ways of conducting themselves politically. But one thing I think is clear is that those original promises of it have really turned into somewhat disappointment for a lot of people, as concerns about surveillance, of privacy, of copyright, of trolling, and the exploitation of data and digital identities have become more prominent. So we could say now, instead of the kind of euphoria that we had in the 1990s, we have more what we can say in sociology, determinist analysis that imagine people who are using or acting through the internet as being passive and indeed in need of protection. What I think they are expressing is that what people do, that is their conduct, is being mediated in relation to myriad technologies and their conventions. But it's also, I think, through those relations to technologies that I want to suggest also that citizens of the internet, who I define as anyone who has the access to it and the means to shape it, are also coming into being. But they're not quite the libertarian type that John Katz had imagined in the 1990s, but rights-claiming citizens who want to activate what I would call the democratic potentials of the internet and its data. So when I speak of data politics, I'm asking, how do digital citizens come into being under various kinds of conditions and possibilities that are not centrally controlled or directed or evenly distributed? What I suggest is that the internet doesn't just enforce particular social or political relations that we engage in, nor do people merely follow its conventions and rules, but it's through the internet that people act in varied ways, and in doing so they take up to what we refer to in sociology as different subject positions. Now let me explain that a bit. What it means is that when people act through the internet, they become subjects in the sense that what they do and how they conduct themselves are always part of and not separate from power relations that make it up. That's to say, we cannot conduct ourselves in isolation, but only in relation to other people and other things, whether it's platforms, devices, and algorithms, or more generally, the kinds of conventions that are formatting, organizing, and ordering what we can do, how we can relate, how we can interact and transact. Any platform or application does all of those things. But it's here, I think, that we can, as we can in other spaces we inhabit, identify spaces of possibility that critical scholarship has analyzed. Drawing especially on the works of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, these power relations mean that when subjects act, they do not only obey or submit to the workings of digital technologies, but they're also capable of subverting them. And as another philosopher, Etienne Balibar, has also argued, when subjects contest those power relations or subvert them, that's when they become citizens. Now, how then might we think about this in relation to the citizens of the internet? Well, what I'd like to offer is that subjects become digital citizens by challenging those conventions of the internet and making rights claims about how it works or how it ought to be working. This is an understanding that I take from a field called critical citizenship studies, where citizenship is not just understood as us possessing a bundle of rights, but also having the right to claim rights, and understanding citizenship as a field of constantly changing rights. Historically, if we think about this, it is by challenging or demanding rights through actions such as demonstrations, sit-ins, protests, occupations, and so on, that people have made claims to the political, social, and civil rights that we possess today. That is, people have not only done so through their words, such as demanding laws, for example, but also through their deeds, such as occupying spaces, signing petitions, boycotting companies, or forming solidarity groups. We can then also, I think, ask, how are people similarly making rights claims through not only their words, but by acting through the internet and thereby performing as digital citizens? I think one way that we can look at this is how subjects perhaps modify conventions, invent new ones, and make demands on the operations of platforms. So if we think of a really popular platform such as Twitter, since 2006, it's gone through considerable changes, such as the introduction of hashtags and the proliferation of images rather than just words. And if you look at its history, some of these changes have been in response to the actions of subjects, such as demands for report options on racist and misogynist attacks, which we've witnessed. But it's also come to take certain and specific cultures of meaning through actions such as retweeting, mentioning, and following, to the invention of particular repertoires or things that people repeatedly do, such as witnessing police brutality, raising awareness about political issues, announcing and organizing events, and forming social groups and political movements. And of course, like all spaces in our democracies, it also includes the actions of businesses. Universities are on Twitter, government agencies, we're on Twitter tonight perhaps, humanitarian organizations, and I must say even political leaders. But I think from the citizen point of view, far from the original idea that it's about status updates, the platform has come to include numerous variations on the meaning of what's happening, to forms such as what do we want to make happen or how do we want to be known. So we see tweeters deploying a number of strategies so that the content of their tweets, say something like a demonstration, are shared and spread and have reach and can also pronounce themselves as a political cause. So hashtags using keywords to mobilize discovery, such as Black Lives Matter, Calais Children, Refugees Welcome, and Syria Crisis. Or retweeting content to modify and make additions, or re-signify content such as the actions of Aboriginal peoples to challenge how they are being represented. I think through these and lots of other actions, we can say that subjects are also part of constituting the data of Twitter and its meaning in often creative, inventive, and really political ways. Now, this kind of talk is different from what we often hear about a digital divide that is seen to be the politics of the internet, and it's concerned with ensuring greater access and educating people to be participants. And I think that's fine, and of course it is one of the politics of the internet. But like other spaces of our democracies, access doesn't guarantee active participation and the rights-claiming digital citizen that I'm talking about. Rather, data politics, I think, concerns the possibilities for people to shape what the internet is by providing freedoms for acting differently. So if we consider, for example, the claims and demands of citizens who do have access and have crossed this digital divide, we can think of women who have been trolled to young people who have been bullied. Their claims for rights, such as to be free of harassment and aggression, are a part of how the internet is being shaped and made. That is, to say that their experiences and claims are part of the making of the internet, and responsiveness to these claims is what makes and shapes its democratic potential. So such claims, I think, can extend to the making, circulating, and then analysis of the big data that is generated by people acting through the internet in these ways and others. Indeed, it's really interesting to think that it is that very accumulation of big data that's also spawning or giving rise to claims making subjects about its generation and circulation. Who owns and distributes and sells, accesses, analyzes, appropriates, modifies, and resignifies data have become objects of struggle in our times for claiming rights that maybe years ago we hardly even thought conceivable. And these data rights claims are not only being demanded, again through words and calls for laws such as data protection, but through the digital actions of which I'll highlight two kinds. One concerns actions that express rights not to be data. Here I'm thinking about actions such as blocking and filtering communications, refusing cookies, encrypting messages, anonymizing identities, or actions of using alternative platforms such as Signal for texting or DuckDuckGo and Ghostery for browsing and AdBlocker to stop profiled advertising. The second set I would call actions that express rights to data, a more of a positive set of rights, such as downloading, uploading, and forwarding digital content. I think these actions express things such as sharing and accessing of data as public goods and rights. And we've seen this in the push for government open data, for example, but also in initiatives that seek to establish open source software and devices and also data commons in the areas of health and the environment. I think such demands for rights to data are well demonstrated in the recent mobilization of thousands of academics, librarians, coders, and science-minded citizens who recently gathered at what were called data rescue events in the United States. They collectively worked to download huge volumes of government data, such as that on the environment, which are now at risk of deletion by the Trump administration, ostensibly because of budget cuts, but also arguably to undermine evidence of climate change. This included data that was not already provided on the Open Government Data Platform, but that which is buried in lots of data bases on government websites. So I would also suggest that rights to data include the right to make and make sense of that data and have access to it. From citizens participating in crowdsourcing or citizen science data collection projects on environmental issues to different forms of data activism, such as hackathons, people are expressing that they're not passive subjects of data, but active citizens in its very making and its interpretation. In this regard, I've been thinking about how data rights extend to what Steve Mann, in a recent commentary in the journal that David mentioned earlier, Big Data in Society, has called surveillance, the exercise of the right to collect data for observing practices from below, such as people who monitor police surveillance at demonstrations or who design apps to monitor what other apps are collecting in terms of data on their devices. What I think these brief examples tell us is that data politics are also about citizen rights to not only their own data, but that which is collectively generated and can serve public goods. It is through, I think, the invention and circulation of these actions that people are expressing I, we, they have a right to, and are moving from being what I called subjects to being citizens as they have done so historically. Now, when I have put this forward to other audiences, one response has been, well, Evelyn, do people really care about this? Don't they just use the internet as a matter of convenience? Don't they just like to use the free platforms? And do they really care about the data traces in the way that you're talking about it? I think, again, if we pay attention to how rights have historically been claimed, it's always started with the actions of a few citizens who have challenged existing rules and conventions. Today, these acts, I think, take the form of releasing documents on state surveillance practices, exposing the biases of algorithms, etc. And of course, some of these citizens are now or have languished in prisons or in exile, just as suffragists did in the early part of the last century. So rights claims have always started through the actions of individual citizens who have expressed the right to claim rights, and it's through those repeated claims that those rights have come to be those that we enjoy. On the argument of convenience, I think it's interesting to think about how today people are incessantly called upon to participate, to engage, to step out of the so-called digital divide. However, when you think about it, much of our contemporary lives cannot be conducted without engaging digitally. The problem now is not a matter of convenience, but the inconvenience of not being digital. This was really painfully depicted in Ken Loach's recent film, I, Daniel Blake, in a scene where the protagonist, Daniel, could only make a benefits claim by completing a complex form on a government computer terminal. It is really hard to watch as he struggles for hours, and it seems that the system itself is trying to do everything to prevent him to make his claim. So indeed, the internet has become ever more difficult to not be part of, whether in relation to government or to business or our social lives. It's no longer separate, but really integral to our social worlds. So, we can lament that condition, and at times it can be a kind of drudgery, or I think we can think about digital technologies as openings to social and political spaces of possibility. We can say the internet really has meaning only through the actions of subjects and the demands and claims of its citizens. People are not only participants, as they're often called, or consumers or users who follow their designs, but can and do make themselves into its citizens by shaping it. I think this affords an opportunity to understand how the everyday life of how we communicate, how we interact, how we network are part of struggles and contestations over the emergence of a new form of political rights. And I think it means to ask, what are the possibilities of challenging, of resignifying the conventions of the internet, and thereby enacting digital and data rights through what is done and not only what we say. As I've suggested, the history of rights claims teaches us that the rights are not fixed, but they're part of our ongoing political struggles, where both the cause and effect are the citizen. So to close, I'll finish with a few words about the interpretation of big data, as there's also a tendency to treat it as raw or simply reflections of people who are all acting in the same way and with the same intentions. From the multiple possible meanings you can give to the use of like buttons and search engine queries to locations saved on digital maps, big data does not speak for itself as is sometimes claimed. I think for this reason, it's really necessary that what a lot of social science researchers do are really important, such as turning to ethnographic survey and interview methods, those old methods of the sociological repertoire, to understand the intentions, interpretations, and meaning-making of subjects who are acting through the internet. So while much has been made about analyzing big data to understand large-scale social processes and patterns of behavior, which is what we usually read about and the kinds of visualizations that we capture and analyze. At the same time, critical questions need to be asked about its interpretation, its meaning, and its very sites and methods of production. So if the internet is to be a space for futures and for societies to invent and reinvent themselves, then I think our challenge is to identify through what configurations do subjects perform themselves as citizens against exploitation and domination. And that's the meaning of data politics that I want to leave with you this evening. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, do you know how I can start the show? Oh, here we go. I'll just start from there. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much for a really insightful talk, Evelyn. I think this idea of when digital subjects become citizens is a very inspiring notion, and I hope that it continues to animate a lot of cutting-edge research in law and the social sciences. And I also just wanted to extend thanks to my hosts here today. I think that the deep insights, the deep conceptual normative insights of David Lyon and David Murakami Wood have really helped so many folks in my part of the academy, the legal academy, and in the social sciences general to make sense of proliferating surveillance technologies. I also am inspired by the work of my legal hosts, including Art Cofield and Bita Amani. And Art's work on tax havenry is so important, I think, in terms of trying to ensure that big data is not just used as a way to control the little people, as Leona Helmsley called people who pay taxes, but everyone in general. And Bita's work in most very cutting edge areas of law and bringing together different areas of law, I think, is very inspiring for what I'm about to go to discuss today in my talk on the future of fair data practices. So from a legal perspective, I often like to start with some case studies and then unfold from the case study the normative implications, the implications for social science and for our everyday practice. And something I wanted to start with was something that seems relatively innocuous, which was a voice and face parser. And there's a company called Jobalign that had an analyzer that would identify the emotional response a particular voice is likely to elicit. I'm hoping that my calm manner will not elicit boredom, but this is something that I think actually a lot of, say, professors could learn from, if you ever had to go through a droning lecture. Or it's something that now is being used, for example, in sales offices, and there are ways in which this type of voice parser could match you to someone who's like you. So we know, for example, from Ryan Calo's work on digital market manipulation, that there are ways in which firms now, when you see an ad online, they probably have some sense of what you look like, on the basis of race, age, location, other things like that. And they can use this sort of digital doppelganger that exists in databases to put an ad on that looks like you, because you're more likely to trust people that look like you, right? And so this is sort of the verbal or audiovisual, or the audio equivalent of this would be, if they hear my voice, they may send me to a certain person that sounds like me, or they might hear someone with other voices, they send them to a person that sounds like them. Okay, so that's technology that's out there. And one thing I tend to think a lot about is how does it get applied, say, in the healthcare system? Because we often hear, healthcare is this benighted sector and it needs to catch up to technology and finance, et cetera. Well, one way in which this sort of technology could in general be used would be, say, in diagnostics or decision support based on facial recognition databases. So we now know that there are forms of machine learning that could, say, diagnose depression from people's faces. And if you look at a firm like Affectiva and other firms that are developing massive databases of facial expression and the association of facial expression with different forms of behavior that might be tracked in other databases, that they are pitching these sorts of things. And also they are developing a theory of gender-based theories, in terms of how different men and women might be particularly prone to respond, et cetera, on the basis of their data. And one thing that comes up, in the healthcare sector when we think about the deployments of this technology are a lot of times, to go to the second side, well, let me start with the first side. We might have algorithms this goes to the Jobalign parser, that would triage in terms of an appointment, right? Because the goal of the algorithm might be, with a certain amount of data that is drawn from, say, calls, they might be able to identify, well, people that sounded this way really were sick, but people who sounded another way weren't that sick, right? So this might be seen as a way of either detecting malingering, might be seen as a way of triaging or prioritizing patients, might be a positive thing, perhaps, if you think that if people are slipping through the cracks and a human receptionist is not fully picking up on the severity of conditions, but could also be a very negative thing to the extent that it is an opaque system that is somehow prioritizing people, and we don't really understand how it works, right? And that is one of the key things that I should get on the table descriptively for the talk is that a lot of these machine learning systems, there's no real theory of how it works, right? It's just sort of like a pattern matching method. And when we move from a regime of having, say, a theory as to why, say, a particular voice might be particularly urgent, to one which is brute pattern matching, then we're losing the human explicability component of things. and that's a worry. I think that definitely is a huge worry in law, and that was one of the topics of my talk at the law school today. But it's also a topic here. Now to press it a little bit further, and I think to a somewhat more controversial application, a lot of the new initiatives in gathering health data are interested in social and behavioral determinants of health and trying to determine, and trying to detect health conditions that might not be detectable or that might merit intervention. So imagine a future healthcare system where this type of depression screening that would, say, see depression on a person's face were integrated into electronic health record software that recorded people's voices or took videos of them. And this is such an interesting question as well for the healthcare system because there are currently debates in the system, and I think I recall talking to some folks at Toronto about this a few years ago, about the degree to which you'd want to video camera, say, aspects of the hospital or deploy sociometric badges to make sure that doctors are washing their hands. But then the question comes, if we've got this type of 360 surveillance capacity, do we take it all the way to the extent that we would want to, say, have this machine doing the depression screening? And one further question is, when do you tell people about that, right? Do you tell them before their appointment that they could potentially be subject to becoming data? And this is why I love the idea within Professor Ruppert's talk with respect to the right to become data and the right to not become data. Because you could imagine that, say, certain groups advocating on behalf of the mentally ill might say it will help us overcome stigma to the extent that more people come out as mentally ill or are sort of helpfully identified as such. But then others might say, I have the right not to be this type of data. I have the right to refuse to, say, have my medical encounter, which really should be accorded the highest levels of privacy and respect for privacy. I have the right to opt out of that. And it's fascinating to me also how this transpires in different cultural contexts. So earlier this month, I was in Taipei with a workshop of the Taiwan Association for Human Rights and privacy researchers there, computer scientists and lawyers. And they're trying to launch a case that would allow people to opt out of the health data collection system there. But then simultaneously, I was supervising a paper by a student from Pakistan a few weeks ago, and he was telling me that, a lot of the cultural assumptions I make about privacy as a person from the United States are not necessarily that valid where he's coming from and where he believes that a lot of global privacy standards need to respect, say, the particular cultural particularity of different areas. And so that I thought was very interesting to sort of see in different representatives of different cultures or different areas of the world potentially saying that we need to be respectful of and cognizant of this sort of cultural variation. But the bottom line, though, is I think that the categorization or the classification of a right to either be part of the data or not to be part of the data, that's going to be a fault line for lots of disputes in the future. A second example that comes out of recent work in health affairs by I. Glenn Cohen and other professors of health law and health policy are that a lot of times hospitals don't know who to reach out to try to bring them in for care. So you might have something like at-risk patient scoring, where this is a dialysis patient, and the predictive analytics program could look at data from 1,000 dialysis patients, say, who are the most at-risk ones? Okay? Who are the ones that really, if we don't sort of bring them in and maybe adjust their diuretics or do other sort of adjustments to their medication, they might be in serious trouble, serious risk of decompensation. And in these types of situations with the patient sorting, let's say they pick the top 15, must those people be told about that process? Again, do they have to opt in or opt out? How can that data be used for the broader healthcare system? One paradox of American research law now is that to the extent that you would use this type of data to generate what is called generalizable knowledge or research, you are subject to much stricter ethical norms than, say, a private firm that did it. So it's so interesting that, like, in many ways, the US system might even have it backward in that it's subjecting lots of institutions that are, say, nonprofit or for a more eleemosynary purpose to very strict regimes of data regulation, whereas sometimes when private companies are dealing with the data, they might have a much freer reign. So that's one question as well when we think about sort of data regulation. Is it really being targeted in the right way? But in this example, I think this raises very interesting questions about, say, informed consent. And if we look at the history of medical law, there was this very interesting pushback where, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, doctors were very paternalistic. They might not even tell a patient that they had cancer. Then we had pushback from bioethics based on autonomy that Jay Katz and others, contributed to, that said, you've got to tell the patient, and they've got to informedly consent to any medical procedures. And now, though, we may even be having a little bit of a pushback where people are saying, it's too much information, you make the decision, doc. Or imagine getting a notice of about 1,000 predictive analytics programs like this that might be at your hospital, right? This is one of the other big problems. For those that want to be a right not to be subject to be part of data, there are now so many data collection enterprises that to fruitfully and constructively exercise that right, you might have 1,000 opt-in or opt-out notices that you would get each year. So on some level, I think, and this is part of the broader rethinking of privacy that I've been trying to engage in over the past few years, is that the proliferation of data brokers, dossiers, uses, collection, analyses of data, they could create a bit of information overload if we only have a consent model, where the idea is it's your responsibility to figure out if you want to be part of this data system or not in this one. Just one example, by the way, there's over 4,000 scoring systems in the US where consumers can be scored as thrifty or frugal, sick or healthy, diabetic, non-diabetic, etc. And to be subject to try to figure all those out just seems overwhelming. It seems like we need some sort of other framework to really regulate that rather than just expecting people to consent or not consent. Another example that I wanted to give that I think is a example where we have an opportunity to draw lessons from the past and pick up best practices is a contrast between Samaritan's Radar, which was a project, I believe, out of the UK, and a project called the Durkheim Project, which is part of the Veteran Affairs Administration in the US. With Samaritan's Radar, what would happen is if you signed up, they would automatically monitor your Twitter feed, and if one of your friends said something that sounded like they were suicidal, it would notify you and say, maybe you should reach out to your friend and comfort them, something, right? Now, clearly this sort of thing is very well intended, right? I mean, Samaritan's Radar has been taking calls and doing very important work in mental health work for decades. But people very quickly found this creepy because they might say something like, oh no, another Trump ad, just kill me. And then, then all of a sudden, maybe 1,000 friends of theirs get a notice like, oh, Frank sounds pretty depressed right now, and this is very troubling, right? You don't necessarily want to have that, especially when the ethos of a lot of these projects is this sort of Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and break things, right? But when you're dealing with software as such, you may not have to worry so much about breaking things, but when you're dealing with moving fast and breaking people or misinterpreting them, that's very worrisome, right? And that's where another theme of my work here has been, we have to sort of avoid this disruptive ethos in all aspects of life, or at least try to cabin it a bit when the high stakes are involved. Now, I think a more positive example of this was with the Veterans Affairs Administration in the US. They have a huge problem of suicide by veterans after they come back from deployments abroad. And what they ask people to do is, rather than just automatically putting people into a system where they would flag them as having potential mental health issues, they said, if you will opt in, we will analyze your social network postings and we'll compare it against a database of people who have committed suicide and those who have not. And when your postings have a certain match at a certain level, then we will reach out to a professional to reach out to you to try to arrange something, some sort of conversation or intervention. And what I like about that is two levels. One is people opted in. That's one level of it. The second is that it kept the professional in the loop. And I think one of the most important things about big data futures is this balance between professional expertise and big data, predictive analytics, artificial intelligence methods, right? And one of the things that I found very heartening is, like a firm like Google, their ethos is very much, let's automate as much as we can. Let's do everything through artificial intelligence as much as we can. But even they recognized with some of their medical results that people who were gravely ill were trying to Google their symptoms. And by the way, Jeremy Hunt of Britain recently, when there was a junior doctor strike, the health secretary said, oh, if there's a rash, Google your rash. You can figure out if you need to go to the hospital or not. And people immediately started tweeting at him, here are two rashes, one's deadly, one's harmless. Can you tell the difference? Can you Google the difference? And that was one assertion of, professionals saying, we really need to be part in the loop. And Google, after complaints about its, say, automated medical information, looped in the Mayo Clinic to develop these cards. So if you were to type into Google now, like stabbing pain or stabbing headache pain or something like that, they might give you a card that would tell you, here's vetted information, not just some random natural cures quackery that Tim Caulfield and other folks have been trying to expose over. I think he's the author of Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything? So so you won't get the celebrity advice. You'll get something that's actually vetted. And I think that recognition is very sophisticated. I think it's very sophisticated. It was good of them to do that. I hope to see more of that from Facebook in respect to this fake news controversy, right? Or the question of propaganda and fake news, because now they had human moderators for trending topics for a while, then they got rid of them. Now they seem to be bringing back fact checkers, and they seem to be bringing back, actually, just as of the last week, warnings about news that's obviously wrong or fake. And that, again, is sort of bringing the human back in, the professional judgment back in. But I think that's, admittedly, this is one small step toward data justice or good uses of big data or better uses, but it's a step. So, I think that actually, I just want to open up to questions as soon as possible because I know these are all very provocative examples. But to wrap up the conversation or the version of my talk is that the bottom line of all of these examples, I think, is that we need to really be able to rethink our concept of fair data practices beyond consent. Because there's so many parts of our life where we're going to be potentially either processed as data or potentially not wanting to be processed as data. It's hard for us to individually keep up with all of them. And so what I've tried to offer, just in a brief sketch here, and by the way, I have a whole manuscript on this that I'll eventually be publishing, but what I'm trying to offer in a brief sketch here is how professions can help us navigate the data overload, the information overload that comes in an era of big data. So I hope my last example was suggestive, and I'd love to give more in the Q&A. So thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so now we're going over to the questions that were recorded from previous events, and Evelyn and Frank are going to address the questions as they come up, and do it in whatever way you think appropriate. That's fine. So Scott, can we roll the questions?
Oh, they're good.
Hi there, my name is Paul Zakopoulos. I'm the Vice President of Big Data and Analytics at IBM. And in a lot of the customers that I see, they're having a big problem taking big data from the privileged few and making everyone a participant in that. So I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on how do you democratize big data skills so that every individual in a company can benefit from the insights had by big data.
I just think about how you stop use of it. No, just kidding. No, would you like me to start?
Well, you've started. Yeah,
okay,
continue.
sorry. So I guess my thought would be that, this is actually a really interesting question in terms of how you organize, say, mathematics education. And it's very interesting to think about. I was part of a group called the Council for Big Data, Ethics, and Society that the National Science Foundation was sponsoring in the US. And one of the things we thought about was, do you have data science courses for everyone? Do you try to make that a required course? Do you consider like statistical literacy to be part of everyone's training, and when do you start that? And I would vet that. I would say as early as possible, trying to get people to have a critical awareness of the statistics that surround them, and to consider that, say, a part of civic literacy, to have that sort of understanding. And I'd also say that, you know, to offer more data science courses, say, even in professional schools. Because right now we have a lot of people, you know, that they're not going to be affected by whatever the early education changes are. And I am particularly inspired by the work of Gerd Gigerenzer, who runs workshops for attorneys and doctors. And he honestly says that a lot of doctors, now I just spent some of my talk praising doctors, now I get a chance to criticize them. A lot of doctors actually don't understand foundational statistical concepts like number needed to treat when they decide on whether to advise someone, say, to take an aspirin a day or something like that, right, to avoid heart attacks. And so this is someone that even for the most educated professions within our society, he's running workshops to try to teach them how to understand statistics better. By the way, one last point about him is that, you know, you probably have all heard of the Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, and some of the work by Thaler and Sunstein and others about how people behavioral economics explores the pathologies in their reasoning. And Kahneman and Tversky, of course, they're the main people. And Gigerenzer is seen as the response to Kahneman and Tversky, right? Because his idea is it's not like these errors in our judgment are hardwired into us. If we could get proper types of statistical reasoning or understanding of our situation, we could act in better ways. So he's a really, I think, interesting complement, and I think his work would help answer Paul's question.
How I'd approach Paul's question is one of the other bits of research I've been doing is studying how governments are starting to experiment with big data as a possible source of new knowledge on populations, for example. And one of the conclusions that they have come to, or many of them have come to after several years, is that the skills are not in one person. What one needs is you need methodologists, you need IT specialists, you need ethicists, we need lawyers, we need sociologists, we even need anthropologists, that for all the kinds of issues that you have raised, Frank, and I have, and the kinds of things that big data bring forward, require what they call a team of people to bring the different kinds of skills to it. And I think there is far too much emphasis on this new profession or field of data science, as though one could invest all of the capacities and skills required in one person or one position. I think to democratize the kinds of approaches and considerations and thinking that has to go into any kind of big data analytics is really where we need to move. And I think that came up in one of the points that you made too, towards the end from one of your examples, you know, saying that we need to bring these different skills together and perhaps even have ethics up front before you even start analyzing, thinking, is this the ethical thing to do? Now, often it comes as, like you probably know too, in law, it comes at the end. Oh, and is it ethical? Well, maybe we should ask that at the beginning.
Yes.
So I call it requires a team. Let's call it a team approach to it. But yes, we all need to have some literacy. I mean, and statistical literacy, I think as societies we were really bad at to begin with. I mean, still a lot of students, you know, we have to drag them into statistics courses still. I mean, now we have to drag them into big data analytics courses. There has to be some basic, I think, data literacy and that, but I don't think we can tool everybody up to be at that capacity of thinking and analysis.
And just to, I think to affirm that point, I did a course 5 years ago now called Health Data Analysis and Advocacy, and I co-taught it with a statistician, because I knew that this was someone who would not only understand the statistics better than I would, but who would know how to teach it better, because he was thinking about that all the time.
Right.
And when my past intervention on legal automation, it's an article called 4 Features of Legal Automation, and I co-authored that with someone that works in coding and computer science, because I felt like we had to work together, you know, and that, I think that teamwork point is a very powerful one, yeah. Great.
Hi, Frank and Evelyn. This is Colin Bennett from the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria. I've just given a talk in the series on the use of big data in the US election and implications in other democracies. And it's one thing, of course, to use big data in order to target consumers, to get them to purchase certain things. It's another thing, I think, to use big data in order to analyze voting intentions, voting behavior, in order to get people to vote and get out to vote. I wondered if you could say something about the privacy implications, the surveillance implications, and the larger issues for our democracies when these data are used in election campaigns by parties, candidates, and by a variety of companies that are now processing extraordinarily sensitive data on people's political affiliations in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah, it sounds like a kind of setup, doesn't it? On my part. I was thinking about this when I was writing my talk a while ago, and it was during or just after the US elections, and I thought of that old method, let's call it an old method on the television, when you have an advert and it says, this is a paid political announcement. It announces, or it's in the newspaper too, this is paid advertising. And I thought, well, why can we not also take that up in our digital worlds, such that when there is, whether it's news or an advert on your social media, this is a paid political advert that is based on a profile that Facebook has created about you. I mean, something like that, I think, which I would call transparency, is the only way to gain trust, I think, back in the kinds of things that we're being flooded with, is understanding their provenance, where they came from and by whom and for what purposes are those ads or announcements coming. So maybe we need some kind of paid political announcement form in elections, when especially social media, et cetera, are being done. And maybe not just in terms of elections, but when algorithms, operate on social media, there should be transparency about how they are sorting the information that's in our feed, and that this is not just a naturally occurring phenomenon. I think we need more of that kind of transparency, but especially, as Colin says, for our democracies, that is really essential.
I completely agree with all of those proposals and those directions for going. I think that is absolutely essential to any potentially fair and balanced public sphere, or to have this type of transparency. I have to say, though, I have another line of research I did for about 5 or 6 years on the First Amendment, the U.S. freedom of expression context, the First Amendment and campaign financing. And in that work, I compared the approach to democratic politics of Habermas and Rawls. And it appeared that, Habermas had this idea that you could essentially try to model an election on an ideal speech situation, or at least, it clearly wasn't that direct, but that you could try to make things as communicatively fair as possible. And I have to say that given some of the electoral antics that I've seen over the past couple of years, and the really cutthroat nature of their deployment by certain political groups, I don't necessarily have so much faith that anyone can sort of make the public sphere a fair fight anymore. You know what I'm saying? I do respect, though, I should preface this by saying, I really respect the systems of campaign finance in Canada, in Europe, and other areas, and I think that to the extent one could develop those principles and apply them to a digital world, that's a very worthy regulatory effort, and it's actually something I'll be talking with German media regulators in May. But I also think simultaneously that there's, if you are worried about, that the worry about democracy may well end up being a worry about ultimately substance rather than was it a fair procedure. And to the extent that and that leaves a lot of folks in a very uncomfortable position, because to the extent you want to try to make it a fairer procedure, you end up wanting to reform certain things or restrict the use of the bots and use of big data to target people. But to the extent that you are upset by the winners of the last election substantively, you probably don't want to bring a knife to a gunfight, and you're probably going to have to learn as well as possible how to be as good a manipulator as they were. And so this comes down to our fundamental conception of politics, right? I mean, do we follow Habermas and do we try to essentially make the public sphere as fair as possible? Or do we try, I mean, and again, the we, I'm so glad you problematized the we, but, or do those who are upset by current political developments essentially decide that they are going to become as Schmittian as their opponents? And I just there refer to the German philosopher Carl Schmitt, who believed that politics ultimately was not about a fair fight or deliberation. Politics was about the friend-enemy distinction and doing as much as possible for your friends and let's just being very tough on your enemies. And so that I think is, and that's a very euphemistic way of putting that, but I think that's the worry, that I think that the public sphere, and this is, I'm sorry to go on at length on this answer, but it's really a struggle I've had because I think a lot of people in the data science community that are trying to get their head around this stuff are both caught in the older model of making it a fair fight, but also sort of are really wary of whether institutions can do that. I don't know. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Denise Anthony, a sociologist from Dartmouth College. Frank and Evelyn, I'm very happy to ask you this question. As you know, in big data, it has important implications for exacerbating social inequality and power differentials in society. But I'd like to hear you go beyond that to think about the implications for fundamental social institutions like healthcare, education, and civic life. Thank you.
Should I try education, or am I trying?
I'll go for health then.
Excellent, great.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll try to do the education briefly, which is that I do think that the rhetoric of big data and predictive analytics in education right now is a perfectly tailored education regime for you. And so the idea is that you could have a robot that has looked at your response to every problem, let's say you're an elementary school student, and can give you the optimal feedback that led to the optimal response to any given problem based on a data set of, say, 1,000 past learners, or 2,000 or 10,000. It won't be surprising to hear that there are many people in education theory who consider this a hopelessly behaviorist approach, right? Essentially you're just figuring out how to get past the next level on the machine, almost like a video game. And so I think the big challenge for in education is, to what extent can we learn from the line of research from Seymour Papert, who really emphasized not having machines that taught people in sort of a relationship of master to subordinate, but teaching students as early as possible that they are the masters of the machines. And so, if we can bring that into our big data approach to education, I'm optimistic, but there's also a lot of danger that it just becomes this new tool of behaviorism. So, yeah.
I think there are lots of great possibilities of big data, and I think when I was talking about opting out, as you called it, from being big data, it was because we don't have adequate mechanisms for people's privacy and anonymity to be protected, or the uses to which that data might be put also protected. So I think we need new mechanisms so that social institutions, such as in healthcare, can leverage all the benefits out of having healthcare data for making our lives healthier and better, while at the same time protecting our privacy and our fundamental rights. So when I was talking about commons, there are lots of initiatives to create data commons where people can donate data for the purposes of research, for medical science, etc., and for those very specific uses, with all the protections on privacy, etc., knowing that just as when we donate blood, it may help us in the future, we know that donating our genome could help us in terms of a future medical need. So I think we need to, what I have called in other work, socialize data. Data is already of our social lives. We are collectively part of its making. How can we re-socialize it and not privatize it for collective goods? Commons are one. I think Sandy Pentland at MIT is looking at using blockchain or distributed ledger technologies for people to donate data so that it can remain completely in the anonymous sphere and be able to deposit it in these sort of collective common banks for research. But being able to say it's only for those purposes, it can't be used for marketing or whatever, or for insurance companies, which are one of the problems when some of this data is taken up and then used against people so that they can't get insurance and becomes very exclusionary. So I think we have the possibility of inventing new forms of commoning data for public and collective good. And especially in health, I think that all of us could agree that we would want to know that that could be used for medical science and for research, and that kind of donation model may be one mechanism that we could think about.
My biggest question about big data is whether the designers of the programs and applications that are running understand the nature of the individuals that they're collecting information about, their vulnerabilities, their level of education, etc., and whether they take this into account when they design the programs.
I guess, am I supposed to go first this time, maybe? Okay, I'll jump in.
It's a tough one, isn't it?
It is a hard one because I think there are a lot of assumptions made about who are the people behind the data that is generated. And this was, I think, where I was trying to close at the end of my talk, and saying there are a lot of assumptions that treat either all people or subjects the same, or interpret intentions and meaning without on-the-ground understanding and experience, and can make grave mistakes of judgment and err on the side of perhaps very deleterious effects. So I think we don't know enough about that. And I think some of the reasons we don't know enough about it, we let the patterns and the kinds of big data analytics provide the answers, whereas I think they're only initial insights. I think we have to more problematize the differences in terms of the kinds of people who are part of the making of that data, and really become more nuanced in our interpretations and understanding of it. So I think whether we call it the nature of individuals or the kinds of intentions or meaning making that is involved in the way people interact with digital technologies, we need better ways of interrogating and thinking about that.
Yeah, I do think that's right. And I want to give one humorous example just as a way into the question, which is I was reviewing a book called Reading the Comments by Joe Riegel, and it was a book where essentially he tells the story of someone that is ranking fire detectors on Amazon. And Amazon is a great example of big data, right? Or this ranking and rating system, give everything 1 to 5 stars. By the way, there was recently a report on competition in legal services in Britain that said this should be done to all lawyers. 1 to 5 stars for every interaction you have with them. And so apparently somebody had a fire extinguisher, and they wrote in their comment on it, "This fire extinguisher saved my son's life. I'm amazed by it. Thank goodness." 3 stars out of 5. And so the question becomes, one would think that like a life-saving invention would at least merit 4 stars, and this question of like and this, by the way, is not just an idiosyncratic, funny little example. It actually completely undermines a lot of efforts to, say, rank and rate hospitals in the U.S. So, for example, there's a lot of enthusiasm about, say, ranking and rating hospitals. Turns out that there was a study in Health Affairs published in 2015 that said that there was almost no overlap among the top, say, 10 or 20% of hospitals by different ranking systems, right? Because each of them has to risk adjust for different factors about how, say, people responded, how they rated them, the patient population, et cetera. So I think is a really important issue in terms of understanding where are people coming from, what is the meaning, right, as opposed to just the star. And that's why I would hope we would never, say, judge a book by its number of stars on Amazon without looking at the justification for why people gave that rating, right? Another example I think that is sort of, and I'm giving examples of the pathological form of this in order to maybe move to a more positive conception. There's a legal scholar who's written an article about big data, and he's said that, let's say that someone dies without a will, and the question is, how are their assets disposed of? Say there's a certain type of asset and we don't really know where it should go to. This scholar has argued that we should look at people who are like that person who filled out a will and attribute to that person, the person who died intestate without a will, what the intention was of people like them. So let's say I just keeled over. They'd ask, who is the 43-year-olds who are 6'7", who are professors, who are whatever. Well, maybe I'm the only one, I don't know. But they would say that's the category, and we'll attribute to him whether he wanted like this, whatever, bank account to go to charity. Sorry? Yeah, yes. So, so I worry about this sort of problem. I think that's not a way to interpret people, right? Or to use the big data as like this initial step of interpretation, I think is the wrong direction as well. So, you kind of have to worry about those efforts. But yeah, I think that they could, I guess on the operational level, I hope they employ anthropologists and sociologists because they really offer, there's so much emphasis now, I think, on just the raw data. And there's less emphasis on the verstehen, the understanding, the effort to really get the narrative of people's lives. So, yeah.
And if I could just add something to that in terms of what I meant by deleterious effects, is that not only do these technologies respond to what they think people mean and who they are, they can also have shaping effects, meaning shaping your life chances and choices. And there's a lot of talk about creating these sort of bubbles or echo chambers that by recommender platforms constantly channeling your desires in particular directions, they kind of reinforce the particular kinds of likes and preferences that you have. Yeah. So I think that kind of effect is also, especially sociologically speaking, really, worrying and important to attend to. So it's only by understanding in the way that you've mentioned here that we can really start to think about that I think critically.
Yeah.
I think we should give them a round of applause for that.
Oh. All right. It's good trading off. Nice.
It's a long show for our speakers, and first they have to speak, then they have to answer questions from some other people, and then they have to answer questions from us. So there's a lot going on here. So we're going to move to general question and answer time, and just let me say, the shorter you can keep your question, the better. Frankly, it's easier to hear a question and to remember it if it's relatively short. So you don't need to give a speech. It's okay. And if you just tell us briefly what your question is, then that would be great and very helpful to all of us. You've also begun to see, I'm sure, the ways that our two panelists are answering questions, and you may want to direct to one or the other, or to both. It's really up to you. But the advantage of kind of getting to know our speakers a little bit is that we might be able to direct at least a first answer to one or the other. Okay, so what questions do we have already? Yeah, Christoph.
Yeah, again on the issue of the use of big data for elections. I was just thinking about political theorists that say that because of how crackable elections are, we should replace representative democracy by elections for representative democracy by sortition and random selection. I was just thinking, in your opinion, whether a system like that would be more uncrackable to big data.
Well, wasn't that there was that old saying by William F. Buckley who said, I'd rather have the first 20 names in the Boston phone book run Boston than the current elected officials. And the promise would be, that I think the false promise would be that you could find the representative person, but on what characteristics would you represent, right? So I'm very skeptical of that, but I mean, I haven't really thought it through very deeply. Yeah.
I'll leave that one to you, Frank. It's an interesting question.
I mean, it is in juries, right? I mean, we do have that in juries, and I mean, there's a big debate in many legal systems as to expand or contract them. So, yeah.
Ancient Greece as well.
Yeah. True.
I have a question for Evelyn, and it was. Thank you. It was very nice to hear your way of framing the digital citizenship.
because you framed it as like active agency, like citizen to protest the power. But I hear I got the very different impression of the same term in different places. Like, for example, at my child's elementary school in Canada here, the school trying to bring more devices, like digital devices to the classroom, and then they say they can teach the digital citizenship better in this way. So it's kind of, I don't think the school is saying they want to make the students protest their teachers. It's more like they usually say like, we're trying to create more responsible citizenship in a Canadian context. So I was, today I got very different impression from your definition. So can you tell me a little bit more about the background of this term? Where did it come from, or what's the different connotations in the big picture?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Because in classical citizenship studies, it is about exactly what your child is being taught in school. It's about being a good citizen and, voting and, being responsible and following the law and getting educated, and that's being a good citizen. However, I take on what a field of critical citizenship studies takes on, which says if you look at how those rights or those responsibilities that your child is being taught today came about, historically they came about by people claiming and demanding them, on the one hand, but on the second hand, that our rights need to change with our times. And how they change is not because elected leaders decide we need new rights, but because people have demanded and claimed them. And that, if we follow that trajectory, that is the kind of capacity we need to teach our children. It's not necessarily just about demonstrating and protesting and challenging in the sense of, in those senses, but also being critical and being able to question perhaps how digital devices are being taught to him about what they are about and how they can use them. And so I think that kind of critical capacity is the one I think in a democracy we would desire and want to instill, but I think which we've got very far away from, where what we do is train citizens to follow the rules as they are, as opposed to question their legitimacy for our current moment, and especially in our digital worlds and lives where things are changing so rapidly. In law, we know the laws aren't keeping up with it. And on privacy, it's for sure one of those areas where we need to rethink it. I don't think we want to leave it only to legislators to tell us what those laws should be, but we need to ourselves be part of shaping that, which means challenging and questioning things. So I hope that's an answer to you. It's a long way around, but it's a very different conception of thinking of citizenship and what it is to be a citizen, which is one who has that critical capacity and can challenge and claim new rights.
Thank you. I have a question over here from Norma.
Thanks to the two of you. That was fantastic. I have a question for Evelyn. Thank you for reminding me that I'm also an active citizen. It's very easy to get depressed when I'm particularly when I'm teaching this stuff to my students, and I'm trying to not totally to depress them. So I really like the way that you say, okay, we're not only passive subjects, but we're also active citizens. But then my question is kind of also related to what Midori was saying. Sure, there are obviously different capacities, right? Mm-hmm. Different levels of capacity of being a citizen. So how do we account for these different levels of capacity? Where do we draw the bottom line? In particular, I liked something like what you said about the commons, for example, and some other stuff. So I know it's an impossible question, but I thought perhaps you can offer some more of these sorts of ideas of how we can account for exactly that, and when you cannot, when you do not have the capacity of being, enact that kind of, or perform that kind of citizenship. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we could say that certainly beyond the digital, and that is what we call democracies. The capacity to be part and active of any form of our democracies is certainly not evenly distributed. So perhaps, back to Midori's question, one part is about educating. But educating our children in that capacity, and not just to be good, digitally, conversant and having the skills. And we teach digital skills, and that's really important. But do we treat or teach a critical orientation to it that also lets them have the capacity to question and to not, be merely becoming a subjected to the technology, but also one who can be part of shaping it. That, I think, as a critical capacity, we don't, engage in. So I hate the answer sometimes that I get in context, say, well, we need more education. Education is always the answer to these things, but in a sense, we do need a different kind of, education to create and help develop those capacities. And I don't think sufficient attention is given over to that.
Did you want to add anything, Frank? I'm fine. Okay. Good. We have a couple of questions here. Let me go 1, 2, 3.
So this is directed towards both of you and a bit of an extension on the echo chambers that we discussed before. So big data is such that large amounts of information are recorded, as the name would suggest. And for me in particular, someone that's grown up with a lot of the information that I put out online being recorded by both corporations and government entities, this is something that is particularly important to me. And so my question is that over the past 10 years and even the past year, I as a person have changed a lot. I don't think that you can make the case that I'm the same person as I was when I was 8 or so. And yet information about me from then until now has been recorded. So what I was wondering from both of you is that given that I've made these changes in the past years and that this information has been cataloged, does this pose a problem for both private firms and government entities in terms of their perception of me and how they use that data? Or is it something that is solely circumstantial and could deal with a specific time horizon?
Well, there's actually a really interesting, if I could jump in on that one, because I think there's this really interesting California law called the California Eraser Law, and that gives people, when they turn 18, they have the opportunity to erase their records on social media networks and other places where they had a digital identity. And it's funny because even Eric Schmidt said during one meeting, the CEO of Google, at that point CEO of Google, said, maybe people should be able to change their name when they turn 21, And he was on some level being facetious, but on another level, I think he was acknowledging a real problem, and this is a problem that Dan Solov has often characterized as the problem of second chances, right, in privacy law. And we see this institutionalized in various ways. In the American Fair Credit Reporting Act, a bankruptcy can't be on your credit report for over 10 years. So that's a way in which people change. They become, say, more able to pay their bills, et cetera. And I think it's the core of the European right to be forgotten. And that, I think, is something that I feel very strongly about, because what's sad to me is that so many journalists, first of all, don't really understand what's at stake. They think that the right to be forgotten is about erasing their newspaper. It's not. It's about ensuring that when someone goes to an authoritative digital archive, the worst thing that you ever did in your life isn't necessarily the first thing everyone sees about you. Right? And I think this question of what Paul Ohm calls the database of ruin is increasingly, it's accelerating in this era. It's also, by the way, there are so many things we're now seeing with the right to be forgotten that are fascinating. Like, for example, a case involving a woman whose husband was murdered 20 years ago, and whenever her name was Googled, the first thing that anyone would see was the fact that her husband was murdered. And her thought was, wait a second, I don't want this to be my whole life, the first thing people think about me, right? And that's one of the great strengths of the European legal tradition, is that they, and I think Europe and Canada have a much more robust sense of dignity and personal dignity and self-determination vis-a-vis the often expansive and, to me, contrived claims of First Amendment protection from, say, the search engines and social networks that say, well, we just get to automate information production and that's our speech, right? So I think you're absolutely right to press forward this idea of digital self-determination. I think it's a great example of exactly what everyone's talk was about tonight, about digital self-determination.
Well, it introduces a really interesting aspect of temporality. In one regard, you could say the only you that marketers are interested in is you today. Your history and your past actually is not too much of a concern or an interest. So I think there's a real sort of now casting, now timing of you that matters more. But the other bit that I worry about is perhaps when you were a child 10 years ago, your parents putting photos of you on the internet and what you might feel about that today. And sometimes I see photos my friends put over their kids, and I think, I don't think that he's going to be happy about that in about 3 years' time. Should you really be doing it? But we laugh at it, but I think, are we also exploiting our own children's rights by putting images of them without their consent? And I'm waiting for that law to say that children have a right not to be on Facebook of their parents' accounts or others. And I think that's one that, especially some of those embarrassing shots that I wouldn't want mine being circulated either. So, yeah, I think these kinds of sensitivities are now coming to the fore because of the proliferation of them and raising really interesting ethical questions, even on the part of parents.
Frank, I was wondering your opinion on what kind of legal devices might need to be implemented for self-driving cars to be integrated into society?
Great question. So I actually have an article in Slate called, it's about the trolley problem in self-driving cars and sort of how people are so concerned about this scenario of, say, a car running into people or saving the driver or things like that. And I think that, one of the things that I try to emphasize in that piece is that, first of all, we have to have sort of a broader societal perspective on the number of lives that could be saved, by having more automated driving. But I also think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how we conceive of the future optimal direction of technology. So, for example, I think in a lot of the US firms like Uber and Google, there's a big emphasis on, I want to have something that takes me to work, and I can read and do work while the car is taking me to work, right? That sort of is the mental model of the self-driving car that you see in many of these firms. When I heard a talk by a vice president at Toyota, he was really emphasizing, we see the future of self-driving cars as a spectrum between chauffeur mode and guardian mode. And in chauffeur mode, you don't have to think about anything. In guardian mode, you are driving, and the car's autonomy simply rests in the fact that it keeps you from doing really horrible things, like, say, running over a toddler that's behind you in your blind spot or something like that, right? That, I think, that sort of spectrum and maintaining that sort of spectrum for consumer autonomy might be a really good thing, right? It might be a good thing for law to pursue. But I also recognize that other folks are going to say, no, the path to efficiency is to optimize infrastructure for as little human intervention as possible. So I guess what I would say is I highly admire what the US Department of Transportation and some state departments have been doing with, say, advice from people like Bryant Walker-Smith, who heads a National Academy's committee on exactly this topic. They've been really thinking about how you optimize infrastructure and technological development for self-driving cars. But I also think we always have to keep in mind the fundamental decision of values as to what do we optimize infrastructure for a potentially hybrid future of humans with cars with human controllers, or are we optimizing for a future of total autonomy, almost like trains, right? And so that's the deep question of values. But I guess I would say that I hope to see really rapid advances in this area, but I also think it's a question that really involves needs a lot of input from social scientists, lawyers, ethicists, et cetera, because there's lots of very difficult questions that come up as we try to implement them. But by the way, if you just want a manual, if you email me, I can send you the link on the Department of Transportation website that says here's all the things that the U.S. should probably be doing that the Obama administration wanted. Yeah. Oh yeah.
No.
Okay. Yeah, and of course, there's also the question of what autonomous vehicles do for space, i.e. public space, which is a question that not many people think about. That's not my question. And my question is actually going back to this idea of the end of consent. And I think I've liked all your answers to these questions, but I have a slight concern that the answers you're giving to these questions are answers about data, not about big data. In a sense, they all seem to be premised on the idea that we can actually have some control over data in a way that we had in the era of smaller data, if you like. And the whole thing about big data, as you were saying, is that the consent seems further and further away at every turn. And if consent is sort of, as you were implying, impossible, how does this work for models of taking back control, for example, or all of these other things that I admire and I think are great in terms of my politics, but how does this trouble that? Because if consent is disappearing into the distance and for example, with the right to be forgotten, if more connections are being made, more data is being collected, it allows essentially a routing round all the time of any legal provision that says you can't do this, but it pops up somewhere else. It pops up somewhere else again, and ad infinitum. How do these things work? Are there other kinds of routes that don't rely on those classical sort of legal protections and our ability to use courts and law in that way?
I forget who goes first on this one. This is a hard one, right?
I'll take it from the self-driving car approach. I mean, technologically, we're able to potentially develop self-driving cars. Surely we can put our ingenuity to this problem in question. I think that the problem is that very little attention has been given to it, and using an old consent model is problematic. Although I've heard of proposals to have like an Uber consent app that would sort of package everything in one application on your device that would say, here's everything you have on there, and you just do it once on it. I mean, I think there are technological solutions to this that can reduce the complexity of it. And when you can say any data that's collected by any of my apps, this is what I consent to or not. Now, we can debate whether we've been talking about big data or not. I think we have. Because even though it's not a volume issue to me, it's any kind of data that's being generated by any kind of device that we're using today that is accumulated, and its very accumulation is what creates its bigness. It can start very small, but it's accumulation that comes to matter. But I really think we need better minds put to this very question, and not falling on the old models, which worked in a non-digital world perhaps, but now are really not practical. I think that you're saying is absolutely right. It's just not practical.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question. I mean, I always try to be a both-and person. I try to keep things together. I mean, especially as my role on like the advisory boards of different privacy rights groups, because clearly there are very different perspectives that come out in these groups about, say, the balance between freedom of expression and privacy, about the balance between consent and, say, obligation to be part of a research enterprise. Like there are rights to information on some level, and I think that's very important. So but concretely, when I think back to the examples that I was giving, I think that you've got to have both. So for example, with like the analysis of someone's social media corpus, you should have, if that's being analyzed by health experts, they should have to opt into that. It shouldn't be opt out, it should be opt in. They need to opt in. And simultaneously, there have to be very strong rules, like the high-tech HIPAA marketing rules in the US context, that prohibit the sale of that data for marketing purposes and for other forms of other purposes, right? Oh, well, that's with the ISP. So that's correct, that there are certain ways in which the current regime in the US is vastly liberalizing data acquisition, sale, transfer, etc. It's very scary, and I don't know. I don't know how one. And the saddest thing is that to me, the more that goes on, the more people lose faith in a public authority that will actually protect them, and the more they're driven to technological solutions. But my problem is that many of the technological solutions end up being false flames. They end up just being very hard to, and anyone who's followed all of the news where they say, use messaging app X, that's secure. Then 3 months later you find out, oh, if you used messaging app X, turns out that you were just putting a big red sign on your back saying to authorities, I'm doing stuff that's suspicious, right? So this is very troubling, right? I mean, it is the bit of our iron cage sort of situation where you really worry that I don't want to see an anarchic situation where everyone's just trying to find privacy-enhancing technologies to beat every threat scenario they can think of. So yeah, no.
Well, further to that, just a little bit, my question has to do with a concept that came up very briefly, and that is the greater good. I'm wondering what applications or filters you've seen where that's been the outcome of a decision, where the greater good was considered to be of caliber that was what was decided. I'll give you a specific example. 7 years ago, I started an event, collected small groups of data. It's now extended to a national event. I have a lot of data, which apparently nobody's been collecting before. So I have a lot of people asking for that data. No potential to opt in and opt out currently, I could go back and ask people, sure, but speaking to that, that's the challenging situation. But more importantly, this is positioned as for the greater good, meaning if this data doesn't exist elsewhere, this is a centric piece of some decisions that have to be made with regards to current provincial legislation. What decisions have you seen that speak to big data and when the decision is based on for the greater good?
And it's the idea of the question that it would be positive uses of big data collections where the people who are in charge of the data resisted, say, pressures to troubling commercialization or to things that would be seen as exploitative. Is that the
intent is different than it was originally begun to collect for?
Okay, I'm sorry. Now I have a legal category, which is secondary uses. so okay, I get this. Now I'm sorry if I can leap in with this. So, I mean, this is a big debate right now, right? Because a lot of privacy legislation has been premised on the idea that one dimension of fair information practices is that it's called data minimization, which is to say that like you would collect data for one purpose and only use it for that purpose, and that was part of your contract with the people you collected data about. And now there is increasing pressure to use data in like a 360 context. So let's say that you might, and this, for example, is part of the controversy over Google DeepMind in England right now. You know, their use of certain types of health data. And I think that the bottom line is that we have to have some faith in institutions that are structured in ways that will allow for an open and transparent debate of that data, especially once it's de-identified. I think there's big difference between having identifiable data that gets transferred or used and having de-identified data where you don't know which person it's connected to. So I think that I'm much more comfortable with secondary uses or alternative uses in the context of de-identified data. I think with respect to identifiable data, that's a real ethical dilemma, and I hope that we have institutions that are capable of analyzing that in a fair and public-spirited way.
And I think that's key. When we do have systems already in place when it comes to government data in the UK, so if you're going to repurpose data that's collected, let's say by the DVLA, the Driver's Licensing Authority, or the Tax Authority, and you want to now use it for another purpose, you have to go to the Parliament, and there has to be an open public debate about using that or repurposing it. So I think there are forums possible for that sort of value judgment to be made that, yes, it's good to use the tax data to improve another public service, but needing to have a parliamentary process for it. So I think we need some kind of transparency if that's to happen, because like you say, going back to every subject for their consent after the fact. So for example, oyster data is used by the TfL in London in ways that I really would like them to use it, because it really does improve the transport system. And there's a public good about moving about the city in a more efficient way, or planning transport systems that can identify where the lock points are, or the block points, etc., and being able to monitor that. But if you were to use that data now for some other purpose, and I know it's for emergency services, to understand what are the best routes for emergency services to move about the city, well then you need to say, well, is that an appropriate public use or good for it? That I think one could make a case for. But even if it seems obvious, I think there still should be a mechanism to do that doesn't require going back to the individual subject. But again, of course, when it's anonymized and it's not identifiable, that's a very different issue when it's already or still has identifiable characteristics associated with it.
And could I just add that your idea with the transport reminded me of something that I wanted to talk about and I forgot, and I just think it's such a difficult issue, which is, you might recall in the news a few months or last year, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, was complaining about Southern Railways or some railway that was owned by Richard Branson, saying, I didn't get a seat, I had to sit in the aisle. And then Branson went back to the video camera of the train, and it showed Corbyn walking through a train car that had some empty seats. And he exposed this and said, look, the lying Labour leader, he lied about the train being totally packed, etc. And so on the one hand, this is an advance for truth. We know something that is, this was not a fair criticism of that day on the train. On the other hand, I really worry about a world in which private entities that essentially have taken on public utility status, like privatized railways, are able to parse massive amounts of data on anyone that, say, particularly gets in their way, or sort of criticizes them. And then the question becomes, are we privy to, say, the driving data of Richard Branson, right? I mean, what's the sort of, where is the parity in terms of data access if we know that there are certain people who have such power over understanding how our lives are? And if you're a commuter in London, you might be on Southern Rail 2 hours a day, right, every day. So they have you for 2 hours a day, a video camera of you, to use against you in any way that they please. And where's the public accountability for that, right? I think that's a really worrisome question.
That's a good example.
Great, thanks. I have another question waiting, but I just wanted to press you a bit further on this one. The question got interpreted in terms of secondary uses, and that's fine, and that appeared to be what was being asked. But that then becomes a question of repurposing, which assumes that there was a purpose in the first place. And that, it seems to me, in some big data situations, is not an assumption that you can make, that there has actually been a preset purpose in the collection of certain kinds of data. There's a sort of subsidiary purpose. It might come in handy, but it's not a purpose in the sense of a deliberate purpose. And, there's a very large and important government institution in Canada that seems to argue that the availability of data is the reason for retaining it and later using it if we need to. Now, that seems to me to go beyond repurposing. Do you have comments on that? Either of you?
I'm sorry to keep bringing up the European legal context, but this idea of a right of erasure is very interesting, right? Or the idea that eventually some data sets should be destroyed. And there was a case in the US that involved blood spot collection. So some hospital decided to take a spot of blood from every newborn infant, and I think it had 300,000 blood spots in its biospecimen databank. And it was ruled that they actually needed to get consent and they should destroy that. And the question is, you really have to wonder, because on the one hand, it could really lead to some major scientific advances, potentially. But on the other hand, it was thought that this is such sensitive body tissue or information that we want to see it destroyed. And I think that, one of the things that I would say about ultimately, the analogy I draw in the Black Box book is I say that when we started the Human Genome Project, we allocated at least 4 to 5% of the money in the overall project to exploring the ethical, legal, and social implications of this knowledge of the human body. And I think that the current surveillance apparatus that's in place is something analogous to that for society. And at least some percentage of the funding for this apparatus should be spent on understanding exactly how far it's going, when, for example, things like this should be destroyed. Because I think there are some databases that, after a while, just get rid of it, purge it, I think particularly, by the way, here's a very concrete example of data that you might want to get destroyed. In many graduate schools or colleges, students might be very afraid to approach mental health professionals, right? They might say, I don't want that to be part of my medical record. I don't want the stigma. In the US, bizarrely enough, some bar associations can ask you if you've had any mental health issues and have that play into your character and fitness examination to be a lawyer. And so law students might say, I don't want to have this on my record, et cetera. And to be assured by authorities that anything that you say or any record will be destroyed after 7 years could be, in a sense, a source of enormous solace for people. So I think that we need to be very contextual about, when is it right to keep data forever with the attitude of an archivist or historian? And when is it right to insist upon certain minimization and destruction of data because of the social context or the uses to which it can be put?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good distinction, because the example from government databases is quite different when one thinks of repurposing. I think what you're pointing to is what a lot of people call byproduct data. So it wasn't intended in the original design. It's a byproduct of the processes that one engages in through the use of an app or a platform, et cetera. And then that byproduct data starts to be seen as having potential value. I mean, the one we see a lot of is how our very use of a platform, our clicks, our movements, the time we spend on it, whether we move to another page, that kind of para data or process data is also now turned into actually a product that is of value. So it's not just that I'm doing a transaction and buying something, but all my kind of movements and browsings and queries become data, which you wouldn't intend when you're on the site to purchase something that was something that data is being collected about. So I think that's an example of byproduct that can sometimes be sold as enhancing the user experience on the platform, right? We do this and you get that check mark. We want to know how we can improve the platform for you, but it can also be sold on and used for other purposes. So that is a really much trickier one. I agree. You pointed to quite an important distinction there.
Can I just add one other thing to that angle, which I think this data about what you do online and sort of unexpected inference this is going to be drawn. You might have seen something online that said, "Let us guess how old you are." Has anyone seen this? And then you click on various dots, and it's like, how fast can you click on the dot, et cetera. And my thought is, clearly there's going to be an eventual demand for this data for, say, detecting early onset Alzheimer's, for other things like that. And I was actually part of a meeting where I saw a proposal by a health data analytics company to employers that said, we will analyze your employees' records and give you the heads up as to what percentage are likely to have early onset Alzheimer's. It was framed as an aggregate estimation, but it's very easy to see that repurposed to an individual level. So to me, part of the answer has to be we have to have a comprehensive list or count of threat scenarios like that and just outlaw those sorts of things. I think companies should not be able to try to project who's going to get early onset Alzheimer's among their employees. Now, doctors, I'm happy if doctors are doing that. If my doctor can tell me that, I'm probably pretty happy about that. Although there is, in the informed consent literature, a very interesting philosophical discussions of the right not to know. so that we should take into account. But I do think that it's all very context dependent. You want to know. I don't want my employer trying to figure out if I'm going to have Alzheimer's early. I do want my doctor trying that. I don't know.
Great. We've got time for one last question.
Oh, yeah.
Evelyn, I just wanted to clarify something. Perhaps I misunderstood, but in your response to David's question about data and big data, my understanding from the response that you gave is that the accumulation of data matters more than whether it's big or small data. And so my question is, do you then see the social consequences of data and the social consequences of big data as being similar?
Yeah. Who was I talking to earlier about this? I can't remember. Sorry. Forgive me. What is big data? What is the definition? I was in large debates about this when back in 2012 we were launching a journal and it wanted to be named Big Data in Society. And we said, well, what is it? And we realized amongst academics we'll never get a satisfactory answer. But we understood that what is really changing from our point of view is the kinds of practices that are generating data in novel and new ways. And it's those kinds of practices that can be generating small data sets, let's say algorithms, or they can be working on and generating large data sets. And we decided that what's really important is all the kinds of practices about how data is being generated and analyzed that matter, not how much or the large volumes or how large the volume has to be or how fast it has to be or how many varieties of data you have to have or all the other kinds of V's that have become part of the definition. So we decided to, focus on practices and say, let the definition come out of people's research and let that be the way the term comes to have meaning and be made meaningful. And maybe it won't be, because I still don't like the term. When I first heard it, big data, it sounds kind of silly actually when you think about it really, like big data. Like, what is that? It doesn't tell you much at all. So by thinking about practices, and maybe that's the way into David's question for me, was I think if we think of digital practices in our kind of digital lives and the data traces and trails that they leave and how their accumulation can be, from rather small to rather large, that gives us the opportunity to get out of a fixation that it has to be terabytes of data. It has to be about, the practices, and those, I think, are where our starting point really gets us into new directions of thinking about the questions that both Frank and I have been raising. So no definition.
Great. On that point, we will close. I just want to say thank you to you guys. I should mention one thing, and that is, although Frank was doing his talk and has been on campus in the law faculty today, Evelyn will be back next week, and there will be a seminar on Wednesday lunchtime, I think. Just ask one of us if you want to know the details about that. But for me, and I think from the expression on people's faces, it's been a super evening. Thank you so much to each of you. And thanks, too, for all of you for coming and staying through 2 whole hours of this material. So thank you so much. Bye now.